Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Distinguished Lecture Series on Crime and Justice at the Rutgers School of Criminal Justice. I'm delighted to welcome Chris Wildeman as our speaker. Let me say that Christopher Wildeman gets to this moment in his life, I think, from a little arm twisting by me. I heard him give a talk in Washington about 3 months ago and ran up to him afterwards and said, or even 4 months ago, said, "You've got to come to Rutgers and speak." I thought both the subject matter, which is of course interesting to me, it's about mass incarceration, but also the kinds of findings and the kinds of approaches that he's taking are particularly important and useful for us to hear. Chris Wildeman is an assistant professor of sociology at Yale. But he's also a member of the Center for Research on Inequalities and Life course, and also at the Institution for Social Policy Studies at Yale University. When he was a doctoral student at Princeton, he spent most of his time, apparently from reading this short CV, receiving awards for his work as he was doing his doctoral studies, and he hasn't stopped doing that. He's interested in mass incarceration, but particularly the effects of mass incarceration on families and on children and on spouses. His secondary interest is in child welfare. In the question of child welfare, one of the biggest stories in the recent history in the United States is how we have grown the impact of incarceration on impoverished communities. Today he'll be talking to us about positive, negative, or null, the effects of maternal incarceration on children's behavioral problems. I'm really delighted to have Christopher Wildeman coming. Thank you.
So thanks for the nice introduction, Todd. I wasn't that nervous until that, but now you got things going. And no one has food and is tired, so I can't tell if you'll be less engaged or angrier or both. So let me just say two things really quickly. First, so I'm happy to be interrupted throughout. I feel like, I'm in like a straight social department, and I feel like there are these 45-minute talks where everyone is like clearly slowly dying or like disagreeing with everything the speaker says, and then that doesn't come out in the questions until minute 46. So let's just get that out of the way right away here. The other thing is that this paper is part of sort of a broader project where I'm trying to essentially sort of look for null effects where I think we should expect to see them. So the paper Todd alluded to was the first one in that series. And the basic idea here is that most folks who do stuff on mass incarceration go looking for negative effects where they expect to find them and then find them. But a different sort of evidence in that literature is to go looking for null effects where you'd expect to see them and see if you find them or if you find more statistically significant effects in implausible directions. And so this is sort of the second paper in that series. So just to give you a basic sort of outline of the talk. Oh, the other thing is I was planning on presenting the book, and then we could see if Sarah or I did a better job. But I decided not to do that. So I'm going to, just a basic sort of outline of the talk. First, I'm going to start by defining mass imprisonment, which I will go through insanely quickly for this audience. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the previous research on paternal incarceration and child well-being. And here I'm going to lean on a lot of the stuff Sarah's done that I've worked on as well. I'm then going to talk about previous research on maternal incarceration. And from there, we'll move into the study. And my research question is, does maternal incarceration affect 21 caregiver and teacher-reported child behavioral problems? I'm then going to talk about conclusions, limitations, and implications, and then future directions for my research, which, especially since you're not having food here, I'll probably just skip, because that seems sort of like overkill for what you have to hear from me. So just to move through these really quickly, what's mass imprisonment? So first, it's this historically novel change in the American imprisonment rate, which also means that we have a comparatively extreme incarceration rate, right? So we go from 100 to 500 per 1,000, and then in terms of the imprisonment rate over about a 35-year period, and then that leaves us at about 800 per 100,000 in terms of the incarceration rate, which, even though you can't see the UK, it is still way higher than all other developed democracies, right? And so according to David Garland, the first sort of criteria for mass imprisonment is comparatively novel and historically extreme rates of incarceration. The other component of it, though, is that these rates of imprisonment are highly concentrated, right? So for men, it's up there. So what you see is these rates of imprisonment are highly concentrated among men. And when you break it down by race and age, you see that they're also highly concentrated among young African-American men. The older I get, the more I want people in the 40 to 44 age range to be considered young. I think I probably cared less during graduate school about that. And then this leads to cumulative risks of imprisonment that are very high for African-American men who didn't complete high school, right? And so here we see that about 3 out of 5 African-American men who dropped out of high school from recent birth cohorts can expect to experience imprisonment at some point. There are seats here if you guys want to move. Okay, I'll move my bags. Okay, so that's the basic rundown on what mass imprisonment is, which I'm sure everybody in this room knows way better than the sociologists at Yale do. So in light of sort of this tremendous increase in incarceration, folks like Sarah and I have been thinking about what the consequences of mass imprisonment for families could be. And most of the research in this regard is on the consequences of paternal incarceration for child well-being. And so I think we know a couple things based on this literature. So first, consistent with the very high cumulative risks of imprisonment for poor minority men, we see cumulative risks of paternal imprisonment for African American children that are about 1 in 4. And then when you break this down by paternal education, what you see here, although yellow with open dots was a poor choice for things I wanted to highlight, is that about 1 in 2 African American children whose fathers dropped out of high school would have their father imprisoned between their birth and their 14th birthday. So again, you see this sort of heavy concentration of risk that accumulates over the life course. Now,
would you say that again?
Sure.
1 in 4?
So it's 1 in 2 for African American children, or sorry, 1 in 4 for African American children, 1 in 2 for African American children whose fathers dropped out of high school. Now, in light of these really high cumulative risks of paternal imprisonment, folks have started to think about the effects of paternal incarceration on kids. And so here, again, for those of you who saw the book presentation, this is overlap. So the basic idea here is just these are the 4 different outcomes that we think about in the book. And these are the different tests that we use. So first, covariate adjustment, just controlling for stuff. Sample limitation, trying to diminish unobserved heterogeneity by choosing a sample similar on specific characteristics. Propensity score models, where we just match things. Fixed effects, controlling for unobserved differences. Placebo models, which are basically just, they're much more common in sort of public health than in criminology and sociology, but the basic idea is just to look for implausible effects, either because of timing or because you know that there's no direct mechanism there. So the thing that people use most often is using future paternal incarceration to predict current child behavioral problems. So there you're looking for a null again. Now, the thing I do want to point out here is that there's no sort of experimental evidence in this regard, right? But we do have sort of a nice battery of different tests that folks have used in this literature. And based on these, we find consistently statistically significant effects of paternal incarceration on kids. The magnitude of the effect varies pretty dramatically across the outcome considered, but we do see statistically significant effects across a whole host of outcomes. And because of the combination of concentration of imprisonment and negative effects, we see these pretty big effects of mass imprisonment on black-white inequality and child well-being. Right? I feel like there should have been a quiz on that before I started. So that's just to sort of give you a sense about what we know about paternal incarceration and child well-being. There too, there, if you want to come. As you can tell, I'm really lazy. I don't like to stand up for a long period of time if I can avoid it, so I've tried to direct people to chairs. Okay, now for maternal incarceration, things are really different. So again, we have a sense of what the social patterning of the risk of maternal imprisonment is. So about 3.3% of African American children can expect to have their mother imprisoned at some point. For white children, the risk is a great deal smaller, and actually those estimates are so low that they're pretty unstable. It's basically using survey of inmates data. You see a similar pattern by when you break it down by level of educational attainment, and what you see is that about 5% of African American children whose mothers dropped out of high school can expect to experience that event at some point. So in terms of the social patterning of the risk of paternal and maternal imprisonment, things are pretty similar. Our sort of knowledge about things is pretty similar. Now, where things get a bit trickier is in terms of thinking about effects. And so I'm going to choose 4 studies that I think are pretty exceptional in this literature and try to highlight those throughout to develop what I think we don't know about maternal incarceration and child well-being. So the first one, which is on conviction, is the 2007 Journal of Criminal Justice article by Beth Hubner and someone Gustafson. I never remember names. The study on GPA is the Hagen and Foster article that came out in Law and Society Review in 2012. And then the effects on grade retention and math scores are both from Rosa Cho's research, who's basically an economist at Brown. And so what you see here is that in 2 of the 4 studies, all you have is controlling for things in terms of the different methods. So no sample limitation to try to diminish unobserved heterogeneity, no matching, no fixed effects. So fairly straightforward sort of modeling strategies. With Rosa's work, you have a very complex series of tests, which are honestly sort of above my head in terms of statistical sophistication, but she uses a combination of covariate adjustments, sample limitations, propensity score matching, and fixed effects. Now, based on this, it seems sort of similar to the research on paternal incarceration, but I think the gap is actually bigger than we might expect. And so there are 3 things that I want to highlight here. The first is the N, the second is the reference cell, and the third is whether there's any adjustment for paternal incarceration, because as we know, lots of women who enter the criminal justice system are tied to men who have entered the criminal justice system as well, whereas for men, most of them wouldn't be tied to a woman who had entered the criminal justice system as well. So it's a more salient issue here. So the first thing you'll see for the first 2 studies is the N is 26 and 47. And with the number of things that they control for, I think there are a lot of concerns about sort of how stable the point estimates are. Although, I love both of these studies. The N is less of a concern for Rosa's study because she's using basically information on all kids in Cook County. And so she has a nice big N. Now, where things get trickier with Rosa's studies, and I think this is a pretty significant gap in the literature, is she uses 2 different reference cells depending on the study. The first is mothers who were incarcerated for less than a week, and the second is mothers who were incarcerated for less than 3 days. I think the thing that's really tricky with that, and this is something that I'm sure everybody would think, right, is that kids are much more likely to live with their mothers prior to incarceration than with their fathers. And those mothers are quite likely to be lone caregivers, or at least primary caregivers. And in that regard, if mom's gone for a week with no notice, that's a big part of the direct effect of maternal incarceration on kids that we're putting into the reference cell. Does that make sense? So for paternal incarceration, maybe we'd feel pretty good about having guys who were just gone for a couple days as the reference cell because family members can cover for him, or maybe he'd had to be gone for work before, or maybe he wasn't living there, so if he misses one sort of visit with the kid, it's something that you can work around. But for moms, it's a different sort of story. And so I think this is problematic in terms of biasing the result toward a null. And potentially missing something that's actually there. Now, the other thing that's tricky with all of these studies, except for the Hagen and Foster study, is that they don't adjust for paternal incarceration in any way. So Rosa, because she's using administrative data, lacks information on whether the father's been incarcerated because the kids and the dads aren't as tied officially in the system as the moms and the kids. With the Hubner and Gustafson study, it's based on the children of the NLSY 79, and so you actually have pretty limited information on the dads. And the only way that you get information about criminal justice contact in general is if the mom or dad was incarcerated when they were interviewed. And so these are sort of a host of issues with these studies. The other thing that's tricky, and again, this is inconsistent with the paternal incarceration literature, is the estimates are really all over the map. So in the study on conviction, maternal incarceration dramatically increases the odds of having ever been convicted by age 23, I think it is. For GPA, you see what amounts to a pretty big decrease in GPA associated with maternal incarceration. I know 0.12 doesn't seem like a lot, but when you control for a gajillion things, 0.12 actually ends up being a pretty big effect relative to other things. And then for Rosa's studies, we see this sort of curious result where maternal incarceration is actually associated with pretty significant declines in the probability of being held back a grade, which I'm going to call a positive effect, but highlight, because if those kids weren't really prepared to go on, then just promoting them is not going to help them either. And then a null effect in terms of math scores. The same thing is true with verbal scores in that paper. So I think, based on literature in public health, and then also the sort of excellent qualitative literature in this area, things get muddier still. So if you look at research on maternal incarceration and birth outcomes, what you see is either a null effect or actually a positive effect, where when women who are incarcerated are matched with comparable women in the community, you actually see that their birth outcomes are better than matched women in the communities. The public health folks seem to think that it's some combination of better nutrition, tighter restrictions on smoking and drug use, and also lower stress levels, especially because of things like housing instability, which are, I mean, I have not been pregnant, but seem like not a great deal of fun while pregnant. Peggy Giordano and Jane Siegel's really excellent qualitative studies paint sort of a similar picture, where you get the impression that maternal incarceration is maybe even good for kids, or it has no sort of average effect. At least that's the way I read those books. I know that that's not the arguments that they're necessarily trying to craft, but when I look through them, that's what I see. And I think the thing that this sort of drives me to think about is, are these sort of estimates that are all over the map because women who end up incarcerated are a so much more select population than the men who are? And so I'm going to use some very simple data from the 2004 survey of inmates in state and federal correctional facilities, but just to sort of highlight what I'm driving at before we actually get into the research question. So in terms of having ever been convicted before, the differences are pretty small. In terms of having lived with the child in the immediate lead-in to the arrest, mothers, about 3 in 5 mothers and about 2 in 5 fathers were living with their children at the time of the arrest. But where you see the really big differences are in these sort of severe disadvantages, which partially reflect things like impulse control or drug use, but also just represent socioeconomic disadvantage, right? And so 18% of mothers who are incarcerated were homeless in the year leading up to their incarceration. 32% committed the crime that landed them in prison to get money for drugs. 29% had ever used intravenous drugs, which seemed really high to me. And then 23% had ever been diagnosed with mental illness. And keep in mind that a lot of these folks are people who wouldn't necessarily have tons of access to the public health system, and because of that, 23% is certainly a lower bound on the number of them that had struggled with some sort of mental illness. Now, the dads were also struggling in a lot of regards, but much less so than the moms. And so my basic sort of argument here, so it comes in 2 parts. So first, most, though not all, mothers and fathers contribute financially and emotionally to children prior to incarceration. And especially for the sort of father side of things, that literature is moving more and more toward thinking about which guys whose absence should have essentially no effect on their kids, right? Because their involvement is pretty minimal. So the second part of the argument, and this is really what I'm going to try to test today, is, but in light of the more severe problems for mothers who will be incarcerated than for fathers who will be, I expect to see null effects from maternal incarceration. And then, as sort of an additional sort of sensitivity analysis, to expect to see the same effects of paternal incarceration that we've seen elsewhere in the literature. So So basically, I want to show you that it doesn't look like there are any effects of maternal incarceration on kids' behavioral problems, but then show you that using the exact same modeling strategy, we still find the effects of paternal incarceration we see elsewhere. So it's not just that, I've made some horrible coding error in my data analysis or things like that. Okay, so I think based on what we have in terms of previous research on maternal incarceration and child well-being, what we need, I think, is a strong broad test. So we need a large N, right, not 26 moms, that's also highly representative of at-risk kids and families. We need extensive adjustment for selection, especially in terms of these socioeconomic disadvantages that I was alluding to earlier, where a lot of the data sets that have been used before don't pick up on sort of the texture of disadvantage in the way that the data set that I'm going to use could. We also want to have information on paternal incarceration so we can try to tease out whether anything we see is a, mom and dad go to the prison together sort of effect, or whether it's an independent effect of maternal incarceration on kids. And then we also need to think about effects on a broad range of outcomes, and preferably in multiple contexts, right? So unlike all the other stuff that I've done with fragile families, we don't just want mom reports on incarceration and mom reports on behavioral problems, right? We'd like to have multiple folks reporting on it so that we're not subject to common reporter bias. And so this leads us to the current study. So basically, I'm going to use the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing study, which I'm happy to discuss in detail. I could make all of your ears bleed from boredom probably at this point in terms of what I know about the Fragile Families study. But just a couple highlights here. First, it's broadly representative of at-risk families. Again, really a nice sort of textured discussion of the socioeconomic disadvantages these families face. And the analytic sample I'm going to use is children with caregiver and teacher-reported behavioral problems at age 9, along with an in-home interview the same year with at least one parent. Now, Fragile Families does not let me put this on the slide. They'll never let me use the data again if I put it on there. But, selection's obviously a big issue, right? We start with 4,898 families, and we're down to 66% of that for one of my tests, and under half for the second one. They wouldn't really cut me off, but some people would get mad if I put that on the slide. And so for the caregiver-reported behavioral problems, I'm just going to use the CBCL. I'm happy to discuss the specific measures, but we're looking at 21 different behavioral outcomes, and so I want you to just focus more on the broad sort of pattern of results rather than specific outcomes that we're looking at. I'm going to standardize these with a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, just so we can think about the magnitude of effects in a similar way across different outcomes. I'm also going to use the Connors Teacher Rating Scale, revised short form, and the Social Skills Rating System for teacher-reported behavioral problems. Again, this is sort of the gold standard in that area to the degree that I know as a non-developmentalist. And this picks up on a sort of host of similar types of behavioral problems, but they have different names because they're more about in a classroom setting. And the one thing that you should be aware of is we found really similar results when we also use total behavioral problems with the teacher rating scales, but you're not technically supposed to sum those in the way that you are for the CBCL. And so, although I had them in before, I took them out because developmentalists got angry, and then I couldn't answer all the questions developmentalists had. So what are some benefits of these dependent variables? So first, I think they provide broad insight into how children will do later, right? And this is an argument that Sarah and I make in the book, which is that by looking at a whole range of different dimensions, you get insight into how kids might do work-wise or how they might do in terms of criminal activity, but you get sort of a range of sort of areas instead of just thinking about one specific thing. The big benefit, and why I'm willing to conduct tests where we only have 43% of the original sample, is because we have multiple reporters for the teacher-reported behavioral problems. And so in that situation, the mom is reporting, the caregiver is reporting on whether the mom's been incarcerated in the last 8 years, and the teacher may or may not know that. So the teacher's not reporting on those. Questions so far? Anything? No? Okay. So the way we're going to code parental incarceration is any new incarceration between the 1 and 9 year interviews. So we're going to use an 8-year sort of range. And there are a couple reasons for this. I mean, the main one is just that so in any sort of given wave, a small enough number of moms experience incarceration that you run into this same sort of small n unstable point estimates sort of story. And so we wanted to make sure that we gave a long enough period of time where enough moms could experience incarceration where a non-significant effect wouldn't just be because we had a small number of cases, right? So in fact, the thing that we would really, really not like to see is a big but statistically insignificant point estimate. And so we were trying to buffer against that. We combine direct and indirect measures of maternal incarceration. So the direct measures are the things like you'd have in the NLSY 79, where the interviewer said the mother was interviewed while she was incarcerated. The indirect measures are things like not working because she was incarcerated, or these sorts of things. We consider the incarceration new, so happening between 1 and 9 years, if we either have direct or indirect confirmation of new incarceration, or if there was a shift from the mom having been reported to have never been incarcerated before to having reported to be incarcerated before. Now, this is tricky, and there are some sensitivity analyses we conducted where we just used this first criteria. In general, the results are pretty consistent, but it's something to be aware of. And based on this, 8% of moms and about 35% of dads experienced incarceration in this 8-year window. So that essentially leaves us with about 250 moms who experienced incarceration in this period, which is a pretty good sample size for this sort of analysis. Now, just to give you a sense of the sort of controls that we include, because I think this is actually, I mean, we're not doing anything fancy statistically, as you'll see in just a second. It's mostly just trying to adjust more extensively than folks had before. And these are all measured prior to incarceration. So model 1, which you'll see in the tables, is just the basic descriptive model. Model 2 includes sort of a host of maternal traits. So we have race, immigrant status, age, education, grew up in a 2 biological parent family when she was 14, income to poverty ratio at the 1-year interview, material hardship, which is things like not being able to pay your rent or having your heat turned off because of failure to pay bills, lives with the child's grandmother, relationship type, and quality with the father, social father present, number of children, and parenting stress. So if you compare this to what you can adjust for in terms of household characteristics relative to something like the NLSY, it's really quite extensive. Control for a host of sort of paternal traits that are pretty similar to figure out if it's not anything about the mom, but it's about the kind of guy that she had a kid with that's driving the relationship we see. We then include sort of extended controls, and I will say that we thought that including these extended controls would be where a lot of the action was, and it turns out that most of the action is in what we were talking about earlier, where it's just sort of crushing socioeconomic disadvantage and instability. But here we adjust for whether the mom smoked or used drugs while pregnant, used drugs or drank while pregnant, substance abuse, self-control, depression, prior incarceration, whether the child was low birth weight, and the child's temperament at age 1. With a newborn, I think bad is the way I feel about all children's behavior in the first year. My kid is always behaving poorly. And then paternal behaviors that are basically the same as dad's. Again, trying to figure out if it's sort of homogamy that's driving things. Now, again, just to drive this home, these are all measured prior to incarceration, so there's no concern that these are actually the mechanisms through which maternal incarceration is affecting child well-being. So we've tried to be really careful with the time order. Okay, so we then just run sort of 3 pretty straightforward tests. I mean, as I said, we're not doing anything particularly fancy here. So first, we just run a basic OLS model with only maternal incarceration. We're acting like we don't have any information on paternal incarceration that happened after the 1-year interview. So we're trying to sort of follow the same way that previous research in this area has proceeded. We then use a propensity score model. With only maternal incarceration, we use kernel matching. I'm happy to talk about that. I find it insanely boring, although I know it's useful. And then we use a basic OLS model with paternal and maternal incarceration, and there we have a both mom only, dad only sort of categorization where we try to get into the texture of things a bit more, and then also show that paternal incarceration does still look like it matters with this modeling strategy. Okay, so now we're on to the results. So this is the basic descriptive model. I apologize for thinking that dark blue and black look very different. So what you see here is 4 of the 11 coefficients are statistically significant. The blue coefficients, so here, 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 and here, blue will indicate statistical significance at the 0.05 level throughout. And so what you see is, according to caregiver reports, children of mothers who experience incarceration in this 8-year period do have significantly higher behavioral problems, but only on 4 of the 11 behavioral measures that we're interested in. Now, this is the interesting part. The second we adjust just for sort of demographic characteristics and level of socioeconomic disadvantage, it's gone. I mean, and this is like gone, right? This isn't sort of big statistically insignificant effects. I mean, this is sort of straight away gone. And as we adjust for the other things, things don't really change that much because we basically destroyed the relationship in model 2. So I do think, again, to sort of go back to what I talked about earlier, because I think this is sort of the really important point, is that I guess at least when I hear folks talk about maternal incarceration, the emphasis is really on greater criminal propensities or degree of sort of drug addiction or these other sorts of stigmatizing things that would be driving a null effect story. And at least in these models, it looks like even if you just adjust for socioeconomic disadvantage, you could wipe things out too. So it's more about the situations aside from maternal problem behaviors, essentially, that's driving things. Now, for the teacher models, you get a different sort of story, and I think this is pretty interesting, even though it's hard to know what to make of it. In the sort of limitations, I'll come back to what happens when we limit the caregiver-reported behavioral problems to the teacher sample only, which is also pretty interesting. So what you see here is 9 of the 10 differences are statistically significant. The other thing is that some of these effects are pretty big, right? So 1/3 of a standard deviation increase in problems with self-control is a big deal.
They did not necessarily know, teachers did not necessarily know that the mother had been incarcerated.
They're more likely to do that with mothers than fathers.
Yeah, they're certainly more likely to. And there's been some interesting experimental research by Dallaire. I have no idea how to pronounce her name. Anything that looks vaguely French, I should try to not even say, I've realized. But she has this interesting experimental study where she thinks of all these really depressing new reasons that a kid could be new to your class, essentially. And so one is like the mom's in drug addiction. There are all these other sort of pretty hard sort of categories. And kid is new to the class because the mom was in prison is the only one that consistently shows a statistically significant difference. So there could be some of that going on with this. Although some number of these kids were already living apart from their mom or living with their mom inconsistently before her incarceration. So maybe if I split it by that, I could get a bit more leverage in terms of the degree to which that's driving it. Okay, so 9 out of 10, some pretty big. Just adjusting for socioeconomic disadvantage, we get down to 1 out of 10 being statistically significant. Now, not to oversell this, right? And we are, even though this is a big sample relative to a lot of other previous research on maternal incarceration, we're going to still have to look at big but statistically insignificant coefficients sometimes, right? So, I mean, a 0.14, a 0.15 standard deviation increase in those things would still get picked up for paternal incarceration, certainly, in terms of the number of folks we have. So it wipes out about half of it if you look at the average outcome here. Moving sort of further down the scale, adjusting for sort of the dad's disadvantage and background traits doesn't do a ton. When we include sort of mom's problem behaviors, you get a little bit of action for the average outcome, and it decreases it between a quarter and a third, depending on the outcome. At this point, we have one that's statistically significant, so it's associated with a statistically significant increase in self-control problems. And then, by the final model, where we adjust for essentially dad problem behaviors, none of the effects are statistically significant. But again, just keep in mind that we're really, the number of controls and the number of moms who experience incarceration, we're really pushing those standard errors up. So a fairly consistent story in terms of statistical significance, but the point estimates are a bit bigger here. So even if they're statistically insignificant, still a bit larger. When we use the propensity score model, we find something pretty interesting. So maternal incarceration is now associated with a statistically significant decrease in rule-breaking behaviors in the kernel models. I waffle on this. So sometimes I want to say there's got to be some sort of developmental mechanism through which that would be possible. And then other times I say 1 out of 20 is about what we'd expect to see just by chance at a 0.05 level of statistical significance. So I don't want to oversell that, benefit for children, but it's still interesting. Okay. So that's sort of the basic overview of the maternal-only results. So here is where, well, not on this slide, on the next slide, but here's where things start to get a little tricky. So this, I think, is very encouraging in terms of not feeling like my results are driven by a weird modeling strategy. Because this is basically pretty similar to what Sarah's found, to what I found, to what Amanda Geller's found. There's sort of a whole group of folks in this literature who have found pretty similar sorts of things with this modeling strategy. And so what you see here, based on caregiver reports, is that if both of them were incarcerated, you see no statistically significant effect. If just the dad was incarcerated, you see an effect of between a sixth and a fifth of a standard deviation, basically. And then if just the mom was incarcerated, you see, again, pretty much a null effect. I actually think the story for both mom and dad getting incarcerated is pretty consistent with the story that I was telling earlier about just when the mom is incarcerated, where, even if there's some sort of proxy for problem behaviors going on there, it's probably a better proxy just for sort of sustained socioeconomic disadvantage. Now, where things get a whole heck of a lot trickier is for the teacher reports. We actually thought about just going with the caregiver reports because we're already running 150 models or something. But we weren't, we thought that sort of the tension here was pretty interesting to wrestle with. So what you see here for the just dad models is, again, consistent with what you see broadly in the literature. 7 of the 9 have a statistically significant effect. The coefficients aren't as big, but they are statistically significant. But where things get interesting is for both, where you see 3 very large statistically significant effects. And then for just mom, where these aren't statistically significant, but they're pretty big. And so I think for teacher-reported behavioral problems, the story gets a good bit trickier. And that's certainly something that we would love to get feedback on in terms of how to interpret it. Okay, so based on this, we have sort of a couple conclusions, limitations, and implications. And again, keeping in mind that there's this sort of messiness, especially with the teacher-reported things that we're going to try to dance around a little bit. So our main conclusion is that across a broad range of behavioral outcomes reported by caregivers and teachers, maternal incarceration is associated with no detrimental effects on children's behaviors unless it happened in conjunction with the father's incarceration. Now that's the statistically significant sort of party line, right? But there is some nuance, especially with the teacher-reported outcomes there. I do think, especially for the caregiver reports, this provides pretty strong evidence in favor of null effects. And the other thing to just sort of go back again is that it's not just an artifact of data or method. In fragile families, we've seen lots of paternal incarceration negative effects sort of studies, and we're able to essentially replicate those with the new wave of data. Now, we have a whole host of limitations that I'll talk about briefly, but that I think we can all wrestle with together, if you like. I mean, first, endogeneity is still a concern. It might actually be that there are big positive effects, and that we're just not able to control in as detailed a fashion as we'd like to. That's certainly a possibility. Attrition is a serious issue. This might be my only 9-year Fragile Families sort of analysis, just because we've lost so many dads by the 9-year interview that it really is getting hard to feel confident, especially with this population, that we're coming up with something representative. I think if you're really interested in family structure, I think it's still pretty easy. But by 9 years for the incarceration stuff, I think it's pretty tricky. Now, the other thing that is really tricky is that sometimes maternal incarceration is harmful, and sometimes it's helpful, depending on some of the sensitivity analyses that we ran. So when we use a narrower incarceration measure, so when we just include the ones where we have direct or indirect reports of new maternal incarceration instead of relying on this ever to never sort of distinction. So we lose about half of the cases of maternal incarceration, so this is now 4% of the sample. But for that 4%, we see harmful effects on 4 of 21 behavioral outcomes, even in sort of the propensity score models. But there's also some evidence that it's helpful. So when this one, I would love to hear what people think, because I have so much trouble wrapping my head around it. So when we limit the caregiver-reported models to the sample of kids who also had teacher-reported behavioral problems. So you didn't go to the teacher reports unless you had a caregiver report. So when we go to those kids, maternal incarceration is actually helpful for 4 of the 21 behavioral problems.
Same one? Which one?
I don't know, sorry. I did know at some point. I don't remember off the top of my head. But the thing that I've really been struggling with that is that, if you remember, the teacher-reported models are where things looked like they were actually going the opposite direction. And so that means that the caregiver and teacher reports might not align quite as well as we would hope, which might just be that kids act different in different situations, but it might also be that there's sort of something going on that's funky in terms of reporting. So this is a tricky thing. I think we're just hoping that this kind of like nudges people toward doing more of this research. So we're pretty much cool with this not being a perfect study, but we just hope it's good enough to move folks along. Now, the big implication here, and I think this is the thing that we really want to sort of get people to focus on a bit, is that we think this calls for broader social interventions before the first point of criminal justice contact for these families rather than after. So if you look at the paternal incarceration literature, I think, although we don't have a natural experiment, absent that, the accumulating evidence suggests that there's some disadvantage going on before, and then there's some stuff that paternal incarceration makes worse. And so post-criminal justice contact, there are still negative effects that we need to address. I think what we see here is that almost all of the disadvantage these kids face is not because of a direct effect of maternal incarceration, but because of sort of a whole host of disadvantages that they faced before. And so we really would need to address these issues before they experience incarceration. So it calls for a different sort of timing of interventions, I think. You don't want to hear about what I'm going to do next. Okay, so thanks for inviting me. Hopefully we can keep having a discussion. And thanks especially for coming at 10.